What's interesting to me is that I think the most nefarious attack on manhood is the one that says that masculinity is fundamentally toxic. We're not in competition with one another. We work together for a common goal, which is our marriage, which is our family, which is our desire to glorify God in what we do.
Our founding fathers here in this country brought about the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
We've heard it said that hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Here to discuss that is Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas. He's a husband, father, veteran, most importantly, Christ follower. So Nick, thanks for joining us today.
No, thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's always good to be here. Good to be talking to another fellow patriot, especially another Christian, because there's not many of us out there, I don't think. But it seems like the people who are speaking out, there's a lot of good people speaking out who are speaking with the biblical truth. But when we look at my generation, Gen Z, the youngest people, the people born between 1997 and 2012, we see a lot of problems. I think a lot of people aren't filled with hope. They see my generation. I think I'm here. I want to bring truth to that matter and actually bring hope to my generation, the people looking at us. So when we look at Gen Z, we see a lot of boys. We don't see many men out there today, do we? We see soft men. We see people looking at Andrew Tate to be a father in their life. So what do you say to the men in my generation who are looking to enter manhood?
Well, I think first thing you got to do is you got to define what that means, right? So obviously we can look at a man as nothing more than an adult, male human. But we all know that there's something deeper to it when we say things like, be a man or man up, right? We don't just mean be an adult male human. We mean something more than that. And the question is what? And I think right now there's something of a battle going on for the male mind. And it's not a binary choice, interestingly enough, because there's some people that tell men that what it means to be a man is essentially be capable, be competent, but then you're largely either serving yourself. There's kind of like this hedonistic approach where it's all about pleasure, and then there's also this approach for power. And then you have this other side that says that masculinity is completely toxic and bad and the source of all the evils and the patriarchy and everything else. And then there's what I would probably refer to as more of the biblical approach to what masculinity actually means. And scripture's, I think, fairly clear that men are supposed to protect, men are supposed to provide, men are supposed to lead. That doesn't mean that all men are going to play the exact same role. It doesn't mean that all men have the exact same capabilities, but there are certain responsibilities which are uniform across what it means to be a man, especially when you take on the responsibility of being a husband and a father. And what's interesting to me is that I think the most nefarious attack on manhood is the one that says that masculinity is fundamentally toxic. Because if you can get man to abandon their responsibilities, you can take over society. Like this is the dirty little secret, right? Is that if men actually buy into that lie, it will be the thing that destroys masculinity, and not just masculinity, it'll destroy society. Because strong men are absolutely needed. I don't care what fourth wave feminism tells us. I don't care what modern progressivism tells us. Strong men are absolutely required. They are a necessity within society. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out here, and this is where things get a little bit interesting. When I look at like Andrew Tate, or some of the other people that we might call in like the manosphere or whatnot, obviously there's a lot of things that they say that I vehemently disagree with, especially when it comes to the treatment of women in relationships. There's other things that they say that I think a lot of us can look at and say, okay, yeah, that's true. Men should be capable. Men should be competent. Men should take responsibility. But for what purpose? And that's really the ultimate question with masculinity. For what? Why be a man? Like, why is it important? Why is it objectively true? Why is it objectively moral for men to step up and fill certain roles? Now, I believe that's because that's the way God designed it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you create a situation where you tell a group of men, let's say that haven't found their purpose, that don't necessarily have a relationship with God, if you tell a bunch of men like that, you're either going to be sheep or wolves. A lot of them are going to pick wolves. And a lot of them are going to say, well, look, if I'm being offered this choice where I've either to be weak and effeminate, or I've got to be the sort of man that takes charge and sleeps with as many women as possible and makes as much money as possible, because that's going to determine that I'm a capable man. A lot of them are going to choose that. Right? It's our responsibility as Christians to say, look, this watered down, weak version of Christianity that you've been fed, this idea of kind of the weak, male, Christian male, because let's face it, a lot of that gets pushed in the church. That is not biblical masculinity. Biblical masculinity is a man that is capable, is competent, is capable of using violence if necessary, but never violence toward the innocent, always violence on behalf of the innocent when it is morally justifiable. And if you're going to be the sort of man that God calls us to be, then you are someone that has to develop yourself spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, physically, professionally, to be able to fill all of those roles. And when you do that, and when you set that proper example, and when you can articulate that example, I think it's a very, very powerful argument, not just in what you say, but how you live your life, and most importantly, the results that you get from it. And so it doesn't require all men to step up, take on that task and responsibility and live it out. If you have a relatively small group of people that are willing to do that, you will be shocked at how many people will be convinced by it, because it works and because it's honorable. And I believe because God put something in us to seek out and desire that. And so that's what I hope Gen Z will understand about genuine masculinity amidst all the white noise that's going on right now, and it attempts to either redefine it or define it as evil.
I fully agree with you, Nick. I think there's a lot of things that culture's telling us to smash the patriarchy, that men are toxic. We go down a whole list of things. There's a few things that men need to know how to do. Like, they need to know how to dress, need to know how to hold a conversation, how to talk to girls. We go on and on again. So how do we reconcile the fact that Gen Z has been really indoctrinated from all sides, from education, telling us that we aren't supposed to be men are supposed to be women, and the gender is fluid, the church, where they're really making service effeminate and not really drawing men to church, and women are more likely to go to church. And when men go to church, we see that whole family come to Christ. How do we reconcile all of these things together, actually teach them and invest in them to become men?
You have to choose to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if I had this conversation once, it was actually a women's magazine, and they were asking me about the whole concept of chivalry, and is chivalry dead? I said, well, no, chivalry is not dead. I said, but you do have, and again, I'm going to go back to fourth wave feminism here. Fourth wave feminism is essentially punished chivalry, and now they're upset because men aren't giving up their seats on subways or opening doors. It's like, well, yeah, you're going to get less of what you punish and more of what you reward. And if you're punishing the sort of behavior that you actually want, then maybe you should take a look at that and consider doing something different. By the same token, men also have to make a decision on whether or not they want to let somebody else, especially people that have identified themselves as your ideological enemies, if you want to let them decide whether or not you act in a chivalrous way, who's really winning by that? Are you really asserting yourself in that way, or are you allowing yourself to essentially be dominated culturally by saying, well, if I don't feel like I'm properly rewarded for this, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say right now, I'm going to be chivalrous because I think it's the right thing to do. Now, if somebody doesn't like it, fine, but I'm going to be chivalrous and I'm going to fulfill my responsibilities. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to be a doormat. And this is one thing that I think a lot of young men are absolutely tired of, is this idea that I'm going to do the right thing and I'm going to be continually punished for it. At what point do I say, fine, you don't want it, then I won't provide it. And I think some of that, I think there's two things here. One, who you surround yourself with and where you spend your time is incredibly important. Secondly, you have to choose, you have to truly think about what is correct, what is right, what is proper conduct for myself, and then do it regardless of what the culture tells you. Because right now I think we're it's a fallen culture. It is a culture that is given over to, critical theory, postmodernism, existentialism, this idea that there's no such thing as objective morality. There's no such thing as objective truth. By the way, when somebody tells you there's no such thing as objective truth, the first question you should ask them is that true? Right? There's so many contradictory statements that are being made out there. It reminds me of that Bible verse that professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And we're watching people say the most absurd things, most obscenely absurd things. And we're all supposed to say, oh, well, I guess an expert at the sociology department at Cal Berkeley said so. So we should all get in line. No, assert what you know to be true. Now, by the same token, and you mentioned this, right, when it comes to intellectual capability, don't just get out there and throw your weight around and say, well, I think that's all crap, so I'm not going to believe it. No, develop yourself intellectually so that you can articulate what you're doing and why it's important and why it's true. But ultimately, I think men need to be seeking out truth, and then standing up for it, regardless of the consequences. This is another thing too that I think needs to be understood. It is wonderful when culture and society rewards people who stand for the truth. But the truth is worth standing for, regardless of whether or not culture or society rewards it. In fact, if you want to build the sort of society or culture that rewards truth, then you have to stand for it even when it doesn't. That's key. And I look at a lot of young men nowadays and I say, look, the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that this sucks. It does. You should not be growing up in a culture where they are telling you that you are toxic by virtue of being a man, right? You should not have, but you do. And what you choose to do in that situation is going to determine whether or not your children and your grandchildren grow up in the same situation or worse, or whether or not they're going to look back and say, I am so glad my father stood up when everyone told him to sit down and shut up. Mm-hmm. So you have a unique opportunity. And I'm starting to see more men in Gen Z particularly standing up and saying, look, I may not have it all figured out, but I know that's crap and I'm not doing it. And that's what it's going to require. Because look, cowardice is contagious, right? But so is courage. You've seen that. Almost everybody has been in a situation where they kind of felt like, I just don't know what quite to do right now. And then you see somebody stand up against everybody and you're like, dang, that guy just said what I'm thinking and I'm not alone in this and I'm going to fight too. And the next time I'm going to be the guy that stands up and gives courage to somebody else. And we need that more than ever. So that's the hope I would give to young men within Gen Z, is that I really do think, as I look at, I'm Gen X, obviously there's millennials. As I look at some of the things that are going on in Gen Z right now, I almost feel like this is where the tide turns. This is the high watermark for all the absurdity that we've heard. I still think things are going to get worse in some ways, but I do think we're starting to see a generation of young men that are standing up against it. The real question is going to be this: are they going to stand up against it in a way that creates something just as bad but different? Right? Are they going to create something that's misogynistic, or are they going to create something that is a true reflection of biblical masculinity and manhood, which is courageous, but is also loving, is also tender to their wife and to their children? That's the sort of thing that we need to be fighting for. And there are people out there standing up for it. Like John Lovell is a great example of this as well, as someone that's fighting for this. You look at guys like Matt Boudreau and so many others that are getting out there and saying, no, there is an alternative, what you're being told. And we're actually going to help foster and facilitate that so that young men do have somewhere to go to say, okay, I don't want to be this weak sauce version. Right? I don't want to be this weak sauce version of a Christian man. I want to be a warrior. I want to be powerful. I want to be capable. And again, it's up to the guys that are a little bit farther down the road. And that's where, again, I think the guys like John Lovell and others come into play, where they're saying, no, guys, your instincts are right. Now let's show you how to develop those capabilities into what it was always meant to be.
Yeah, we're completely on the same page right there. That the reason we fight is for the next generation. It's not for me or you. It's for your kids, my generation, for Gen Z. Because like Ronald Reagan said, freedom was never more than one generation away from extinction. And he said, I don't want to be sitting on my porch telling my grandkids what it was once like when America was free. I agree that today we're seeing the turning point, not just turning point in the organization, but the tide is shifting to the right for men. But to address the issue, we have to first understand how it came about. So do you think the situation that we're in today was intentional? We were led here on purpose through Karl Marx, through intersectionality, anything like that? Why do you think we're here today?
I think there's a couple of things we need to realize. First and foremost, we can't. It is a mistake to try to point to like one individual and say that's why we're here, right? Karl Marx or Klaus Schwab or Herbert Marcuse or whatever it is, Jean Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir. Like it's yeah, they all contributed to what we're seeing today, but not one of them. There's no Bond villain. Right, you want a Bond villain? Satan. Satan's a Bond villain, right? Like that's the entity that Scripture tells us is constantly working against us. But part of the reason why, whether you want to call it critical theory or neo-Marxism or postmodernism or a lot of these theories that are now working in concert with one another, you mentioned intersectionality. James Lindsay refers to it as American Maoism. Um, One of the reasons why a lot of these things have been so enticing is because they actually appeal to an aspect of humanity, a couple of aspects of humanity. And they purport to deal with real problems. Like we all agree that there's poverty in the world, there's injustice in the world, there's sickness in the world. And we all theoretically agree that we want to do something about it. The difference is that when you look at Marx's approach, and Marx focused a lot on the economics, at least that's what he's known for. He actually talked a lot about family and sociology as well. It's a mistake to think of Marxism as just an economic theory. Um, but what you saw in each one of those situations is that they felt that the best way to deal with the problems of society, the best way to create a utopia on earth was to create this sort of society where we had no private property rights, and the nuclear family was essentially abolished, and any sort of sexual norms were abolished. And it was this idea that you were going to be liberated from all of these social restrictions, and these that have been arbitrarily forced upon you. And then once we just realized that we were all just one humanity and we were all going to work together and own things collectively and work in concert with one another, then we would remove all these stigmas that had held us back from experience true pleasure and true purpose and true meaning. And it's interesting because the first time anybody proposed something like that, it was a snake talking to a woman in a garden, right? It was the idea, did God really say? And if you do this, you will be like God. Well, think about it. It's the problem is that all of these norms, like the family and all of these society and religious norms with respect to, treating sex as something sacred between a man and a wife, and a husband and a father, and a mother and a wife raising children together. And that there's supposed to be limitations on our quest for pleasure or power, and that there's a higher moral order for which we are accountable to. It is tempting to human beings to cast off all of that and simply turn pursuing our own pleasures into the height of morality. And that's what you see with things like Haslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization is at the top of the pyramid. Well, what's self-actualization? If it's me identifying as a different sex, well, then that's the highest moral obligation for me, and anybody that stands in my way is evil, right? If maybe it's something entirely different, but whatever it is, it's this inward looking thing where if I desire something and somebody stands in the way of me getting it, or even if someone just suggests that I shouldn't necessarily get everything I desire in the moment, well, then that's wrong and that's immoral. It's the complete flipping of the Christian moral ethic on its head. And so, yes, Marx is foundational to a lot of that because he popularized so much of it into this quasi-scientific theory and understanding of sociology. But there's been several characters that have done it. Probably one of the most influential has been Antonio Gramsci. And Antonio Gramsci was a socialist that was in prison in Italy in the 30s. And he made the argument that where Karl Marx got it wrong is Karl Marx thought this was all about economics ultimately. And economics would be the thing that would cause people to go over to communism and socialism. And Gramsci came back and he said, Marx wasn't wrong with respect to the end state that he wanted. Marx was wrong with respect to how we would get there. It wouldn't be economics because, as Gramsci pointed out, capitalist countries actually do a pretty good job of delivering on the goods for everybody, not just the wealthy. He goes, no, the way that we're going to do it is we're going to compete for all of these culturally shaping institutions within society, and we're going to create a counterculture and a counter narrative to everything else. And that's where you get this idea of deconstructionism. That's where you get this idea of the long march through the institutions. And we're starting to see that now in the West, especially in the United States, where they have been dominant within higher ed, within Hollywood, within the arts and entertainment, within media, within journalism. And whenever an ideology becomes that prominent within all of these culturally shaping institutions, it's reasonable to assume that it's going to take on and become the cultural norm. And so right now, I believe our obligation is to fight back against this and say, look, not only do we feel this is incorrect, and not only can we logically explain why it's incorrect, but practically we should all be able to look around and see the obvious problems with this. It's amazing how the people that pursue self-gratification as if it's the highest moral achievement never seem to be happy with what they arrive at. Why is that? Maybe it's because you're not just a consequence of billions of years of accidental evolutional processes leading you to this point. Maybe it's because you actually were beautifully and wonderfully created in the image of God. Maybe there actually is objective truth and objective moral order. And maybe when you live in accordance with that, it achieves wonderful results, both personally and socially. But again, if we want to make that argument effectively, we can't just articulate it, we have to live it.
Well, you're right on point with that last answer there, but we can't talk about just the masculine side without talking about the other side. The culture is saying that the future is female, but on the other hand, they're just eradicating all females together. Take Biden's Title IX executive order into account. They really want females in the future, or are they just trying to defeminize females today? I know you have a couple daughters yourself. What do you say about that, and how can we raise biblical women, and how have you done so?
So I actually don't think the objective of this is the future is female or masculine or whatnot. I think they would rather reverse or kind of eliminate those categories altogether with this idea of just identify as whatever. And there's this statement that we always say, and I think James Lindsay really popularized it, but he said the issue is never the issue is always the revolution. And I think he's right. It's for many people in this ideology, it's about the consolidation of political power. And so that's why one day it will be, oh, we're experiencing a war on women and the patriarchy is the problem. And the next day, well, of course, men can get undressed in women's lockers rooms and compete in all of your sports as long as they identify as one. Because again, it's not a question of logical consistency. In fact, logical inconsistency is more beneficial when you look at the sort of arguments that are being made and the sort of objectives. So I don't think this is about uplifting women. I think when it makes sense for them to consolidate power, they uplift women. When it makes sense to lift somebody else up, they lift somebody else up. And these things do not have to make sense. I mean, let me give you probably the most obvious modern example. Queers for Palestine. Okay. I just have a question, like an honest question, right? And I'm not using any of these terms pejoratively. I'm just going to ask, do the queers for Palestine know what they do to queers in Palestine? Right? Because the government in Gaza doesn't treat LGBTQ people very good. So why is there this strange alignment going on? Well, because it happens to be good right now for the consolidation of political power. That's what this is. So if you look at everything from an oppressor and oppressed dynamic, well, then if they're oppressed and we're oppressed, then we're on the same team. And it doesn't matter if those two groups actually don't particularly like one another or would be fighting one another or doing what they do in some places in the Middle East where they actually kill them. Because right now, the important part in the United States and the West is the consolidation of power. And so if you're allies, you're allies. That's it. And you don't see a lot of intellectual consistency. So I think it's important to understand that this isn't about, whatever new flag goes up or whatever new issue of the day comes up. Don't be surprised when in a year it's something completely different and contradictory. Because if you give into that oppressor-oppressed dynamic, well, then they say politics makes for strange bedfellows. In this case, it's totally absurd. So I don't think it's about, uplifting femininity. But that begs the question, right? Like if we want to, because I do, I was speaking at an event a while back and it was primarily women in the audience. And the thing that I said there is true masculinity is necessary for femininity to be able to flourish. Because one of the biggest roles that I see that we have as men is to protect and to create a safe environment where femininity can truly flourish. There is something about, here's the way I worded it. It is not a woman's job to make a man good, but it is absolutely fascinating how much influence they have on that process. Because I know as a husband and a father, wanting to live up to my wife's expectations of me, to my wife's belief that I'm a good man is incredibly influential to me. Wanting to be the sort of man that my daughters can look up to and respect and love is incredibly important to me. And so I think genuine femininity is actually incredibly strong and very, very powerful. If you look at what they call the Proverbs 31 woman, that's a woman who is, brave and beautiful and industrious and innovative and nurturing and intelligent. So this idea that the Christian woman is just supposed to be some docile person that walks around the house barefoot and pregnant and does whatever the man says, that is not an accurate depiction at all of what a biblical, what a Christian woman or what Christian femininity is. Like I said, it's all of those attributes. My wife sometimes says, "Yeah, the Proverbs 31 woman is intimidating," and she is. But again, I think this is the problem. There's been a lot of political capital that has been made from pitting men against women and women against men. And sometimes it's gone predominantly in one direction. Other times it's gone predominantly in another direction. Here's the issue. I believe God made us different. I believe God made us equally valuable before God. I think we should be equal before the law. But I don't think we're supposed to be competitive with one another. I think we're supposed to be collaborative. In my marriage and in my household, my wife doing certain things allows me to be better at the things that I do and vice versa. We're not in competition with one another. We work together for a common goal, which is our marriage, which is our family, which is our desire to glorify God in what we do. And the end result is that we have a very happy marriage. And it's happy spiritually, it's happy emotionally, it's happy physically, all of those things. And so, again, I think that we need to not only uplift and defend masculinity, I think we also need to uplift and defend femininity. And you're seeing more and more of this. And some of it, you see the trad wife movement, right? Or the trad woman movement. It's this idea of a traditional woman. And there's aspects of that is very popular within like the homesteading movement and stuff like that. And I think that's great, right? I think it's wonderful. But that even in itself is not the complete picture here. The complete picture of Christian femininity is that idea of the Proverbs 31 woman. It is the idea of women and men working together in, again, not competition, but collaboration to build a home, to build families. And man, I am telling you, when people embrace it, instead of looking at this order and saying, "Oh, I don't like that because it puts restrictions on me," or "I don't like that because it makes assumptions about what I should want to do or not want to do." No, it sets in place guidelines that when you follow them, you get incredible results. I consider myself to be a pretty masculine man. My wife is the handyman around the house. And we embrace that. Why? Because she's really good at it, right? She's very industrious in that aspect of life. And by her doing that, I'm able to focus on other things that I do, whether it's providing through my occupation or other things. But what it is that we find the ways that we as husband and wife click and collaborate and work well together. And the end result is just something so beautiful that when people see it and when they experience it, they want more of it. And what they realize is that that God ordained order that was put in place, or the various roles that we fill, they're not so rigid that, a woman can never do certain things or a man can never do certain. That's not what it is. It's about understanding primary roles and responsibilities, appreciating the strengths that your wife or your husband bring to the table, building upon that in order to create something even better called your marriage, called your family. And those things end up being so much more rewarding and fruitful and providing so much more meaning and purpose than the sum total of its parts. And so, again, as men, we need to foster that. And I will tell young men too this, because I know many of them are frustrated trying to find a woman that wants that. If you're having difficulty, right? If you're having difficulty finding where is this woman that wants these things that I want? The biggest thing that I can tell you to do right now is obviously keep that in prayer. But the other thing I would say is think about the sort of wife that you would like to marry, the sort of woman that you would like to spend your life with, that you would like to raise kids with, and start looking at yourself in the mirror. Like, am I the sort of man that would attract that kind of woman? And if the answer is no, well, then it's not her responsibility to make you that. It's not her responsibility to marry you and the hope that one day you will be. Start working toward it, because that's the other thing I've noticed is that when you start working toward improving your relationship with God, when you start to actually develop the capabilities that you need in those 5 areas that I always talk about, spirituality, emotion, and intellect or the intellectual, the physical, taking care of yourself, and the professional, the ability to provide. When you start working in those categories, you're going to find that you're now becoming the sort of man that the woman you want to marry is attracted to.
Mm-hmm.
So focus on those things. And because one of the things I will say that is a big mistake that I think a lot of men are making right now is they're so frustrated by what they see going on within the feminist movement or with the culture at large. And it's so discouraging. And they just go into this feedback loop where it's discouragement, discouragement, discouragement. See, I told you, they're all the same. You as a Christian man do not want to be defined by the worst elements of men or masculinity on display out there. And they don't want to be defined by the worst aspects of feminism or false femininity on display out there. Mm-hmm. So if you start working toward the things that you know you need to develop, and then going to the areas where you're far more likely to find someone that is on the same mission as you are, that has the same sort of values and commitment and foundations and faith that you do, you're going to find it a lot easier to find the sort of person that you actually want to build a life with. And she's going to find it a lot easier as well. So that would be, again, hopefully something that's hopeful that, guys, men, we need you now more than ever. You culturally, you are needed now more than ever. I know that, we always harken back to the days of like World War II and storming the beaches of Normandy or after 9/11 and going into combat. I know because I was that guy. I was sitting there in the 25th Infantry Division when the planes hit the Twin Towers. Within months, I'd volunteered to go, or I can't remember. I think it was within the same year I'd volunteered to go to Army Special Forces. I wanted to get to combat. I wanted to prove that I was a warrior. I wanted to prove and look, all that was fine. But the most important mission I see going on right now is not a war fought in some faraway land. The most important conflict I see going on right now is actually the war for the hearts and minds of the people in this country. And what do you really believe about truth? And what do you really believe about God? And we need young men to stand up and actually appreciate what that conflict looks like, the role they play in it, and to step up and play the role that they were made to play.
Yeah, what you're saying, Nick, is exactly what me and my good buddies just had the conversation about after church for 2 or 3 hours on Sunday. Finding the woman, but first being the man who she will attract, but finding the same values, the same mission together. I've got one last mini question. If you could tell Gen Z, men and females, one thing not to give up on, what would it be?
I think if I had to come up with a verse for this generation to hold on to in the midst of everything, it would be in the New Testament where it talks about the peace which surpasses all understanding. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I think that's such a powerful verse is it's not the peace that everyone gets, right? If you're rich, you're powerful, things are going well, there's no insecurity in the world, there's no major conflicts, and you're at peace. Okay, well, everyone gets that. The world understands that peace. They don't understand the peace amidst chaos. They don't understand when everything seems to be falling apart and you're aware of it. It's not as if you're naive to the problems and you're doing your part to fix it, to be a positive element within the world that you occupy, but you have a peace which is secured in your relationship with Christ and the ultimate knowledge that you know who wins. Mm-hmm. If you can hold on to that and not look at all the things going around you and let it make you angry or discouraged or depressed, but instead say, nope, I was born for such a time as this. God was not confused about what would be going on at this stage in history, and yet he wanted you here right at this point so you could make the most incredible impact possible. Embrace that. Embrace the peace that comes with knowing that, and then go out and do it.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. Philippians 2, really great chapter, great passage that Paul wrote. And thanks, Nick. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate all the wisdom that you have. I think Gen Z needs more people to stand up like you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.